Hello and welcome to Newchip's online demo week. My name is Armando Vera Carvajal and I'm the Accelerator Director here at Newchip. We're so pleased that you are tuned into this week-long online event that welcomes hundreds of Newchip startups alongside thousands of investors and entrepreneurs from around the world. Today we're joined by a very special guest and influential member of the global venture capital community. Please welcome Katherine Boyle, a partner at General Catalyst, which is a venture capital firm that partners with founders from seed through growth stages to build companies that withstand the test of time. Katherine focuses on the transformation of civic institutions through early stage investments in innovative technology companies to drive meaningful change in what was once the domain of government departments, including aerospace, defense, education, transportation, infrastructure, and also public safety. She is a board director or board observer of Anduril, Titan, Hallow, Nova Credit, Literati, Spring Discovery, and a number of unannounced companies. She also co-leads General Catalyst's seed program. Before becoming an investor, Katherine was a staff reporter at the Washington Post. She received an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where she was a teaching assistant to Dr. Condoleezza Rice for her course Political Risk: How Businesses and Organizations Can Anticipate Global Insecurity. She is also a graduate of Georgetown University and holds a master's degree from the National University of Ireland, Galway, INSEAD, and a master's as well from the University of Bristol. Katherine, thank you so much for joining us here today at Newchip's Online Demo Week. It's such a pleasure to have you as our guests. I know that you're very, very busy, but we're privileged and honored that you've made some time to join us here this week.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, look, to kick off the conversation, I would love to talk about your career path. You were a former reporter at the Washington Post, and you covered a variety of stories. Your background was in political philosophy, public advocacy. So tell us about at what point in your career you made that decision to become a venture capitalist and join the startup world.
Yeah, no, I wish I could say that it was a very methodical choice on my part, but I sort of happened into it. I was very fortunate and very lucky in many cases. So I was a reporter at the Washington Post between 2010 and 2014. And that was around the time just before Jeff Bezos bought the paper. It was a struggling paper. I mean, it was a terrible time for the news industry. And so I had a friend who I was talking to about what are my options. You know, I'm probably going to get fired soon. And she said her husband was just getting out of the Navy and he got into Stanford Business School, and they take people who know nothing about business. Maybe I should apply there. And I got very, very lucky again and was fortunate enough to be accepted and moved to the West Coast, packed up 2 suitcases and kind of started life afresh. And when I got there, didn't know much about venture capital. Like I didn't say so at the time, but I knew very, very little about how this industry worked. And so I was cold emailing people, trying to get in front of people, trying to learn as much as possible, because I had this thesis that it was very similar to the work I did as a reporter. And I was very fortunate. I cold emailed Peter Thiel and he responded, and I was able to intern at his firm Founders Fund while I was in business school. And that was sort of an eye-opening experience for me, because going from someone who was a complete outsider from Silicon Valley, from venture capital, had never worked in a startup, to being able to see kind of the inside of workings of a top venture capital firm, it was just an extraordinary gift. So I, left the firm, was looking for a full-time job, talked to probably 40 or 50 different venture capital firms, and really had a lot of, negative responses. A lot of people who said it's not going to be possible for someone who's not a technologist, you're a reporter, like there's not much overlap, and was fortunate enough to be introduced to General Catalyst. And General Catalyst was really the first firm that, when I kind of shared my unique background and life story, they said, "Oh yeah, like we understand that." And everyone at GC has a very different path. Everyone has a very different experience. Our founder David Fialco was a filmmaker. There were so many different experiences that kind of bring this unique team together. And so they were very open to the diversity that I brought to the table. And I was very fortunate to join as an associate about 5 years ago now, and I've been there ever since. And it's been a great experience to be able to learn from the rest of the team, especially a team that has so many different backgrounds.
That's incredible. And, it just goes to show that there are many different paths into this community. Yeah. And it's so encouraging to see that openness and that willingness to bring different perspectives, right? Because sometimes if the VC community is locked in an echo chamber with the same mindsets from the same programs, how are we going to identify new innovation, right, to back globally? So very, very compelling. Something that I also find so unique about you as a rising leader in the global venture capital community is that your background as a reporter fundamentally frames your daily thinking in terms of storytelling.
Yeah.
Although all humans are hardwired to identify a story, as an investor, you actively seek entrepreneurs with great stories who are building also great companies. So tell us more about how this storytelling mindset has shaped your perspective on entrepreneurship and also impacted your quest to build a transformational tomorrow for the world.
Absolutely. So I think one of the most under or misunderstood things about investors and particularly venture capital is just how, if you're an early stage investor, there is so much unknown. There's no financial documents to look at. There's no like diligence that you can do about past stories that are going to be confirmatory of what's going to happen in the future. So you really have to look at the people. And this is the thing that's sort of the core focus of General Catalyst early stage practice, but also kind of my core focus is that you're looking at people and the traits that they have in order to weather an extraordinary journey. I'd say like the most epic journeys that people can go on today is building a company, building something from nothing. And so you have to look for certain traits, tales of perseverance. And the thing that I always say is that most founders, they're like imperfect protagonists in a novel. They're not perfect. They don't come from cookie cutter backgrounds where everything's worked out, perfectly over the course of their life. And they're certainly not going to have perfect journeys as founders because building a company is hard. So the thing that I look for is I look for really unique stories. Like, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Why are you passionate about what you're building? And that's something that I think it kind of really frames how we look at founders and kind of what they're trying to achieve.
That's very passionate. And I think, do you have any examples of some stories that have really stood out for you over the past few years that you say, this is not a very conventional or cookie cut story of a founder, and that's why I want to back that founder?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd say the thing that I sort of specialize in, or the thing that I'm always saying, is that I invest in stories and kind of contrarian narratives, things that no one really believes. And, most founders are sort of fighting against the conventional wisdom of their industry or even the conventional wisdom of the world. And so that's something that I very much look for. I'd say a very good example of a company that was doing something that people thought was a little crazy is a company called Anduril Industries. And we invested in 2017. They're a next generation defense contractor. And the reason why people were stunned by what they were doing is there has not been a new defense contractor in America that sells directly to government since after World War II. There's smaller ones, but this idea of we're going to become the next Lockheed Martin, we're going to become the next Raytheon. These are legacy companies, and it takes a very, very long time to build them. So when Anduril came in and said, we're going to be able to build the next great American defense contractor focused on software, artificial intelligence, and basically helping keep our men and women in uniform safe with new technology products. The mission was so bold, and it was something we very much wanted to believe, but very few people believed it outside of what Anduril was saying. I mean, it's such a hard mission to achieve. And so, we listened to the story, we listened to how they were experts that had worked together before. They had worked at Palantir. They were very mission driven in how they wanted to support our men and women in uniform. They were thinking about, we know how to sell to the government in a way that a lot of other people do not. We also know how to build hardware and software products. We know how to recruit. And so our view was, if anyone can achieve this mission, it's this team. And so our investment in the company was very much a team-focused investment of, this is a unique DNA of a team that really understands why now, why they can build this product now where they couldn't have been able to build it 10 years ago. So that's something I think is very important. Is, a lot of the contrarian narratives that we back, the reason why we're backing them is not only because of the founders, but they really understand why something can be done now that couldn't be done a few years ago. So that's a perfect example of a company that has gone on to scale and become a very important part of the defense ecosystem in America.
That's incredible. And I think it's spot on in terms of some of the perhaps less considered industries, right? When we talk about startup innovation and venture capital investing, there's a lot of industries that are a little bit more old-fashioned that still require a lot of innovation. And the few founders who are willing to take those on often are the ones who've been in that space for a long time. Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about your path so far and the impact that you're making in terms of change. So you've supported a lot of companies so far. You just talked about one right now. And you believe in innovative companies that drive meaningful change. Here at Newchip, we also believe in companies who can create social impact for the world. Very, very important for us. Now, I'd love to better understand what you mean by driving meaningful change. It is, such a general term, and do you have any particular method or framework to define what that means for you as a professional investor and also General Catalyst?
Yeah, so I mean, General Catalyst has an overarching thesis that really impacts everything we do, and we say we invest in responsible innovation. And what that means is, we very much believe that founders need to think through the important impacts that their companies are having. And I think because we have those conversations with founders, and because we're so focused on certain verticals that are actually going to democratize access to products, or we have an entire health assurance platform that's focused on making sure that affordable healthcare is available to all Americans and all people around the world. These sort of important missions, I think, just affect every decision that we make at the firm. And I'll give you a great example. So I focus on civic technology. And the thesis of our civic technology practice, which is a very differentiated practice, in that we're not talking about GovTech. We're talking about companies that are having important civic impacts on people that used to be in the domain of government. So when we talked about, in the introduction, we talked about aerospace, defense, transportation, education. These are areas that are core to every American, to every person around the world. And to use technology in order to augment those experiences and improve those experiences is something that we find to be a very, very important mission that we're working on. The other thing, I mean, when I think of companies that I work with that have unique missions, it's hard to say, okay, we have an overarching theme, because founders are so creative in what they are working on and what they're willing to achieve, that we actually back a lot of what we call N of one companies, where there aren't a lot of competitive companies in a space, but there's a founder who had such a unique problem that they're looking to solve it in a unique way. And I'll give you a great example. I work with a company called Nova Credit, and they are a cross-border credit or cross-border credit agency, or a credit reporting agency that helps immigrants get access to financial inclusion products when they move from country to country. This has never been built before. This is such a unique product. There's 3 massive credit reporting agencies across the globe. They do not link their credit. So if you're a person moving from a different country, you're likely not going to be able to take your credit history with you, and it's going to impact your entire experience of starting your life afresh in a new country. And so this is a company founded by immigrants who had this experience of moving from country to country, of starting their life afresh, whether it was for school or a job, and they didn't have the ability to bring their credit history. And so that's an experience that, some people have, but not all people have. And it takes unique founders to really understand the pain points, to understand the kind of how they can solve a problem that really hasn't been solved before. And we look at that kind of mission and we say it's democratizing access to financial inclusion, it's democratizing access to financial products. And it makes us really excited to be part of these missions, not only because they're great companies and great founders, but because they're really improving society.
I love that. And I think the responsibility aspect of it is super important. And I'm just so happy to know that General Catalyst is driving this as a key tenet of its philosophy. Talking a little bit more about the fund itself, General Catalyst is one of the most prominent VCs in the world. And one of the most amazing things that you do is that you do support early stage startups. As an entrepreneur myself here at Newchip, we know how hard it is for young companies to fundraise. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is the typical criteria, and how do you find the founders that you want to back, that you say, wow, this is a really, really good opportunity?
Yeah. So it's, the hard thing about early stage venture is that we're constantly changing our views of what the future looks like. We're constantly, like in terms of where do we find people, we find them all over the world in all sorts of cities. I mean, one of the things that's, I think, important about our civic practice, and also sort of this, this view that we're going to be investing all over the country, is that I think, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it made sense why people were congregating in hubs, why they were congregating in Silicon Valley, why you had to go to New York, why you had to go places in order to access talent. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that is no longer the case. It's that you can hire people all over the world. We have companies that are completely remote, that were completely remote before the pandemic, but are now educating and coaching other companies on how to build this. We're a remote firm. We've been operating remote. We have offices, but we've been operating remote for over a year and a half now. And so in many ways, I think that's what's exciting, is that a lot of early stage investing has fundamentally shifted coming out of COVID. That said, there are still things that we're always looking for. And I think that it goes back to this original point about the founder's tenacity, the founder's vision. The thing that I always say is that, not only does a founder have to have a unique vision, but they have to have people who are following them. And this is I think the second part that a lot of people forget. I look for founders who have posses. Because if you are a very inspirational figure, you will constantly have people following you no matter what you do. You look at someone like Elon Musk, he has a massive, massive posse. He didn't always have a massive posse, but he always had people who believed in the crazy things he was saying. In 2002, when he was talking about rockets and talking about something that was not even scientifically possible to do at the time, he still had people following him. So that's something that we look for, is how inspirational is the founder. Not only do they have to have tenacity and grit and perseverance to get through the rough days of building a company, they also have to ensure that they can inspire others to be on that journey with them.
Totally agree. And I think the inspirational piece is super important because if you're looking to back leaders, they need people who have that ardent desire to follow that vision and mission. On the flip of that, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see founders make, especially at the seed stage when it comes to fundraising?
So I think it can be very difficult for a first-time founder, a seed founder, to go into offices of venture capitalists and to get feedback and to stay true to their core vision. So one of the things that I'm constantly looking for is people are always going to tell you that it can't be done. People are always going to tell you to change your vision, to change your product. Your customers will tell you to change your product. Like a lot, there's a lot of things that will happen in the early days of a company that can sway a founder's initial vision. And I think there's a nice, healthy balance between receiving feedback from your customers and augmenting the product versus changing the vision of the company. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see is a lot of founders are not, they're not able to stand up to all of the different forces in the world that tell them that what they're doing is not possible. And what I would encourage early stage founders to think about is, even if a venture capitalist passes on your initial idea, venture capitalists are often very wrong. And even if you're talking to people and they don't believe that you can actually build what you're doing, whether it's a technical challenge, whether it's just too intensive in the industry that you're in, the most epic companies usually have to go through hundreds of no's to receive a yes. That's what's actually amazing about a lot of companies in my portfolio in particular. They heard no from a lot of smart people, and those same smart people want to back them now. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that even if you're hearing no, that even if candidates are passing on you because they don't think it's possible, or maybe people aren't necessarily believing your story, like, you have to maintain your core vision while also being intellectually honest with yourself. And I think that is the hardest part about being a founder of a company, is this balance of intellectual humility, trying to find the truth about what you are seeking, but also balancing that with unwavering belief that what you are doing is the right mission, and that you're working on something incredibly important.
I love it. Very, very good advice and strong wisdom. You mentioned civic technology a few times a few minutes ago. You now lead Civic Technology, which is a newly formed sector for General Catalyst, with a focus on 5 core areas of investment that are growing rapidly and also highly regulated, including aerospace, defense, national security, public safety, education, transportation and logistics, as well as advanced manufacturing, rural development, physical infrastructure. Tell me about, what is the driving motivation behind launching this investment thesis, and perhaps more importantly, why now?
No, it's an important question, this why now question. It's something we ask all our founders, and it's equally important about why we're launching this vertical. So, we've been looking back through our portfolio, and we have long invested in these civic companies in education, transportation, aerospace, defense. So it's not necessarily something new. But one of the things that we were really reflecting on, particularly during the pandemic, is that, Silicon Valley venture capitalists and venture capitalists across the country, we say we're very good at building culture, and we are good at building culture. We say we're very good at backing businesses that support businesses to make business more efficient. But the thing that we're uncomfortable saying is that we're actually very good at helping government. A lot of the problems and the gridlock that we're seeing in Washington, the companies that are solving the big, hairy problems in America, they're not politicians and they're not policymakers. They're people who are they're founders who see a problem in their community and they're building to solve that problem. I'll give you a great example of an amazing company in our portfolio called Guild Education, which is helping to upskill the American workforce by allowing people who work at Chipotle and Walmart to go back to school and get credentials or get the degree that they want to get. And what they have figured out, and this is a wonderful founder named Rachel Romer Carlson, who I've known for a very long time. She was trying to find any way to solve this problem. And it didn't matter whether it was a company or a nonprofit. She was just trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And what she realized was that building a company and building a venture-backed company that could scale rapidly, that aligned the missions of major Fortune 500 companies with this mission of how do we upskill the American workforce, actually was going to lead to the most change in the least amount of time. And that's why she built the company, which I think is an important thing to think about. The founders who go into the civic mission, they're not just thinking, how do we build a valuable company? They're thinking, how do we solve this problem that is important in my community in the shortest amount of time and benefit the most people? And what we believe in the civic vertical is that because of the gridlock in Washington, because of our political climate, because it's very difficult to get the talent in Washington, young talent that understands engineering, that understands kind of next best technology to work in Washington, we have to partner with the private sector. And so our view is that the next 10, 20 years of technology is actually going to be focused in these very big, important problems, massive markets, education, transportation. These are massive markets that affect, Americans across the country. So we're very excited to formalize this practice because so many of our investments have been focused on solving these big problems. And we just think there's going to be more and more founders, more and more companies that are focused on these civic missions.
And, staying on that point, I'm a firm believer that entrepreneurship is one of the most powerful mechanisms and catalysts for solving the world's problems. And I'm talking the big ones. Many, although some may argue that most of those problems are civic issues that would normally fall under the purview of the government. In other words, we as humans would traditionally expect our governments to fix them. I'm talking about climate change, public education, infrastructure, sustainable development, clean energy, clean water, clean anything. Now, over the recent years, we've seen a general decrease in the trust that the general public places on government and the efficacy of its institutions to solve these types of problems. Why do you believe it is often easier to fix civic problems through startups rather than policies and bureaucracies?
So I think that's the important question. And I think there's been a fundamental change as to why that's happening. It's never been easier to found a company. And of course, the founder journey is always hard. But in terms of setting up a company, you used to have a lot of land or have a garage so you could set up servers. Now you can just found a company in your apartment. It's never been easier to find amazing engineering talent. That understands software development. I mean, that's one of the things that I think has really shifted in the last 10 years is the number of people going to coding academies, or the number of people teaching themselves how to code, or the number of people, majoring in college and computer science. This is a fundamental shift that there's now talent to support a lot of these missions. And then I think the other big change that has happened that I think is actually fueling this economy is that capital has become very cheap. There's a lot of venture capital dollars going into the private sector, which means that if you're someone who's debating, I can go to Washington, I can support a congressman or a congresswoman for 10 years and then hopefully get a bill passed through Congress, even though it's completely gridlocked, or I can spend that 5 years building for my community and using technology to solve these problems, whatever problem it may be. 9 times out of 10, young people and very ambitious people are going to choose the latter. They're going to choose, okay, let me try to work with my friends. And I think there's been so many good examples of how that's been done in the past few years that it's inspired a lot of people to look at that choice and to say, actually, we are going to build a mission-driven company. You mentioned climate change. And when I look at, someone like Elon Musk, he has done more to impact America's view and the world's view about climate change, and particularly electrification of vehicles, than a lot of governments have. And I think that's something to remember, is that, a very charismatic founder who's focused on solving a core problem can have a greater impact in many cases than someone who goes into policy, although we still need great people in policy as well. But I think it's very, very important for people to realize that, you can do amazing things by building a company, and that you can particularly work on these important civic issues in a way that's a lot more efficacious than in some cases going to Washington and trying to lobby Congress.
I absolutely agree. And I think, to the Elon Musk point, we're seeing the electrification, but also space, right? Yeah. Space was something that for many decades seemed to be just dwindling. And you mentioned years back, right, when he was talking about rockets, nobody thought that this was going to happen. And now he's leading the pack, right? There's a big new renaissance of a space race, right? Not just in the US, within the ecosystem, but also globally, right? China just landed on Mars. Elon wants to go to Mars. I think it's these inspirational figures that are with their dreams and their projects and plans leading the charge and helping government, right? Also stay apace with with everything that we're trying to do as a global community for the next level of our advancement. Yeah. Now, as we all know, the world has been through a very tough time over the past year and a half because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's still not over yet, right? Many countries are still very affected, including India, Brazil, etc. Many startups are also struggling to secure funding and investors. And investors are increasingly careful about picking deals to mitigate the increased risk. How did COVID-19 change your investment strategy?
So what's interesting is, I think there are a few ways to react to COVID, and we're seeing that a lot of the investment dollars have actually risen. So what's interesting is, I think, in March of 2020, there was sort of this moment of what's going to happen. And in terms of the companies, it kind of forced companies into two sides. Like some companies really accelerated their growth. We saw this with companies that were doing food delivery, companies that were really sort of part of these quarantine categories, saw just extraordinary growth if they were helping people actually be able to live a better life while in quarantine and during this pandemic. Healthcare companies, telehealth companies, did far better during the pandemic, and it sort of accelerated maybe, in some cases 10 years of progress. While other companies, that maybe had relationships with physical space, that were maybe more related to entertainment, but not entertainment online, we're just saying entertainment offline, they struggled. Companies related to travel really had, or corporate travel really had to kind of think through, how are we going to be able to weather the pandemic? And so it did kind of have this big impact on pushing companies into two sides. What's amazing is that, we were able to see a lot of our portfolio make the changes that were needed in order to be able to continue growing and kind of continue on the path during the pandemic. And I'd say those are the companies that I'm particularly most proud of, seeing, some of the companies that were really hard hit because their missions were stalled, are coming back, and they're coming back roaring, that we're seeing in right now. And it's been really kind of uplifting to see that the companies, had to go through these hard times, but are now coming in and seeing the light. So I think in terms of that, that was definitely one impact that we saw. I do think that it changed something better for venture capital. And what I mean by that is everyone was forced to experiment with a work from home experiment that actually worked quite well. We're not talking together face to face right now. We're talking, from two different locations. And what I think that does for founders is it democratizes access to capital in a way that would not have happened before. And so when I look at where I invested during the pandemic, I invested in founders who I've never met before, still haven't met. I invested in founders across the world and across the country, in places that I usually would not go to or be able to invest in. And I think it also kind of did this interesting thing in venture capital that hasn't really been talked about, that I think it actually democratized how founders were choosing, particularly successful founders that had their pick of the litter, were choosing newer and kind of, maybe lesser known venture capitalists or people that they were willing to take a chance on, because it allowed for this sort of, there used to be this thing, you have to break bread with a founder. Like you have to take them out to dinner, you have to wine and dine them. And I think there was just this understanding of, we're actually going to get to know the people. We're actually going to get to know how people feel about missions. And I think that's so important because, if anything, what it means is people who may not have been able to fly out on private jets, or people who may not have been able to get into Sand Hill Road because for whatever reason, they couldn't get on a flight and meet with investors, or maybe they don't present well in person. For some reason, I feel like this shook up the deck in a way that's going to really benefit the outcasts, the outsiders, the people who usually feel like they don't have the same sort of access. So I feel like coming out of COVID, there's going to be a different view of how we invest, that sorts of founders we back. And I think it's really accelerated a lot of the questions that venture capital has been wrestling with. And so I'm very excited about that, because I think we're going to see a lot more diverse, different, and particularly in terms of location, we're going to see a lot of different types of founders be able to come out of the pandemic raising capital very well.
That's incredible. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask, do you feel like this new normal is going to stick, or do you anticipate that much of the venture capital community will revert to sort of the wining and dining physical aspect of it for the initial filtering of potential deals?
So I think it's going to stick, and I think it's up to founders to make it stick. So I wrote a piece during the pandemic. I actually had my first child during COVID, and I wrote a piece called "Can Zoom Save the American Family?" And what I was focused on was this, I was pregnant during the entire, quarantine. No one really knew about it. I shared with the people, I shared with my firm, I shared with people, but the thing that I thought was really equalizing about it was, like if you have a baby next to you, it's very hard to go to a board meeting. But in COVID, it didn't really matter. And I think it was just an extraordinary thing for founders to realize, actually, we can get work done far less time. We can get to know people just as well over video. And I do think that it's going to allow for people who, for whatever reason, maybe they're taking care of an elderly family member. Maybe they can't hop on a plane for whatever reason and go meet with investors. And I think it's up to great founders to say, actually, remote work is very equalizing. And it allows for me to pick the best candidates. I don't have to pick someone who was lucky enough to be born in San Francisco or New York or one of these tech hubs. Like I can pick someone who works in the middle of nowhere and they're just as good. So I think it's going to lead to a much more meritocratic just environment in tech overall. And whether that's, in the investment community, whether that's in the founder community, or whether it's in the engineering community, I think everyone's realizing that this experiment was actually very successful for technologists. And so I'm very excited about that. I hope it sticks. I'm very much going to be a person that's a champion of remote, because I do think that it helps with a lot of these issues that tech has been wrestling with.
I totally agree. And congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think that's just a big badge of courage, especially during a pandemic, right? These very just crazy, unprecedented times. Interesting point, right? Once you go through a very important life-changing event like that, having a child, and you're with the baby there for a long time at home, you don't want to go back, right? You don't want to leave the child and be in the office all day. I think a lot of those situations have been felt around the world in the professional community. Yeah. We don't want to leave our house. We don't want to leave our families, our community, our people, right? So I think it will stick.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is, for a long time, work from home was seen as a lifestyle choice. And I actually think it should be seen as a productivity choice. I actually think that, we look at our own investment pace, the investments that we've made in the past year. And we can honestly say that we have made some of our best investments during the pandemic without having met founders face to face. That says something about sort of the myths that we used to tell. And there's a reason for that. In the 50s and 60s, when corporate culture was being developed, people were living in the suburbs, they were going on trains into the big cities. And it was just this corporate culture that was dominant because it was pre-internet. People forget that the corporate culture that we had been living in before 2020 was a pre-internet corporate culture. And so we have the ability right now as founders and as the tech community to say, actually, we should change the culture of how we work in the office, the culture of how we work as a company, because we haven't changed it since post-war. So I'm very excited about that, because I think most people are realizing you can be just as productive working from home, and that it actually is much more equalizing for people that do have other responsibilities, whether they're taking care of elderly parents, or they're just taking care of family members, or whether they have responsibilities in their community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had some conversations with people in the commercial real estate community, REITs, and they're saying we have to adapt as an industry, right? Because a lot of the decisions people are making in the corporate world is, it's no longer sort of like, do we want to have hybrid models where we work a few days from home or in some days in the office? Some people are saying, I don't want to go back to the office. Yeah. And that industry also has to adapt to the new trends and changes that may come out of this new world. What is your advice for founders that are trying to adapt to this new normal? I imagine email is still a very big part of their outreach process, but how have you seen the best founders that you've invested in get in touch with you as an investor?
Yeah, so there's so many great platforms now to get in touch with investors. And one of the things that I think every investor has different platforms where they hang out. I'm a big fan of Clubhouse. In fact, I was on it pretty much every night during the pandemic. And I met a lot of people that way. I meet a lot of people on Twitter. There's a lot of founders who I've never met in person, but I have great conversations with on Twitter and on various messaging platforms. And so I think that's, when you look at sort of particularly, Gen Z, a digitally native generation that really understands that you can build meaningful relationships on Messenger. Like you can build very meaningful relationships on Twitter. And so I'm excited about that, because I think what it means is, it used to be you have to come into these fancy offices, you have to sit down, you have to have coffee, you have to, there's one method in which you can meet investors. And I think as there's more younger investors kind of coming up in the industry, No, actually, you can hang out playing video games. You can hang out on Discord. You can hang out where young people and where founders hang out. And that's what's exciting to me, is that it doesn't just have to be sort of this kind of old school way of meeting people. You can meet people in a variety of ways. So for me personally, I love to hang out on Clubhouse. I love to hang out on Twitter, probably too much. But I've met many great founders that way.
Totally agree with that. I spend a lot of time on there as well. I need to follow you to hear your thoughts. Switching the conversation a little bit, going back to sort of the involvement of government, the U.S. is the core hub for entrepreneurship and innovation worldwide. Recently, President Biden continued the international entrepreneurship parole for foreign startup founders who meet certain criteria. In the meantime, the American administration keeps improving the fundraising environment and encourages people to support the whole startup ecosystem. In your opinion, what else can we be doing to improve things?
One, I think, there's a reason why immigrants found so many great companies, and it's exciting. So I think, I recently announced that I'm moving to Miami, and that's where we're launching our civic practice out of. What I think is amazing about Miami is that it is I think it's the only city where the majority of people living there are foreign born. That's extraordinary. And it's very exciting, because when you think of, okay, what is the history of innovation? A lot of people who build companies, they're used to wanting something better. They're used to, leaving everything behind and building something new, building something from scratch. And so when you look at someone like Elon Musk, when you look at, some of the great founders that we look to, as sort of examples of building really hard problems, they're often immigrants. So I think that's very exciting. It's one of the reasons we backed, Nova Credit, which is very much around this mission of helping people move from country to country as well. In terms of improving the overall ecosystem, one of the things that I think I've been really, really happy about is just seeing just how much education there is about how venture capital works. It's why, we as a firm are constantly talking about, how do you get access to capital? What does it mean to be a great founder? I think a lot of this sort of education about company building has become so public that's the thing that I'm really excited about. That, like, really, I look at someone like Harry Stebbings, who's the 20-minute VC, who started a great podcast out of an office, out of his house or basement in London. And you hear all of these stories of people who have started these incredible platforms and learned just through whatever is publicly available. And so what makes me really excited is that you don't have to go to Harvard Business School anymore to learn how to build a company. You don't have to go to these elite institutions. You can literally just get on your phone and listen to podcasts. You can learn about how company building works and how venture capital works just from getting on the internet. And I think the more and more that happens, and the more accessible we can make venture capital, and we can make building technology companies, the more we're going to see people solving important civic missions, and that we're going to see just a blossoming of startups, which I think has already happened.
I absolutely agree. And I love hearing that from you. I think it's also about taking that knowledge and applying it, right? I think there's just no excuse nowadays to say, well, I don't know how to do this or how to do that, or I would have to get a PhD everything's out there on the internet. And it's just about the willingness and the desire and commitment of a soon-to-be founder to put it out there and build it out.
Yeah. And also, one thing to add to that, I am a huge believer in the cold email. So, I'm not joking when I say that I sent a cold email to Peter Thiel and that changed everything, and that I sent many, many cold emails, including to firms when I was looking to get a job, and cold emails led to warm introductions, led to an introduction to General Catalyst. It takes a lot. You have to think of it as a numbers game. You get a lot of no's. Every great founder I know, in my portfolio heard a lot of no's before they heard yeses. So it's a hard thing to do, but at the same time, someone will say yes. If you keep pounding the pavement, someone will say yes. And so that's something that I think is also important. It comes, learning about best practices, educating yourself, but also just having the tenacity to constantly email people and constantly try to get in touch, because people are very excited to meet with people who are persevering.
I think that's a really good point. And, I'd love to get your thoughts really quickly on the perseverance piece of the cold email, because we firmly believe that here at Newchip. It's something that we drive culturally with all of the startups we serve. You have to be persistent, right? You have to keep following up. What, in your opinion, as an investor, has worked? Has there been an instance where the startup has emailed, you perhaps said no, they emailed again, you said no, and then after a few times you said, okay, yes, and then it made sense? Does that happen, or What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. It happens a lot, actually. And I'd say, the amount of emails, and this is one thing that I think, if you think of, it's a sales job. And so the amount of emails that a given investor gets is pretty high. And so a lot of things fall through the cracks. And so I often view it as, if you email someone once and it doesn't work, or if they email and say, hey, it actually might not be a fit, getting to a warm introduction, if someone if you kind of get your foot in the door, can sometimes help as well. I know personally from experience when I was trying to get in touch with investors, there were investors that I cold emailed who did not reach out. Or did not respond. And then I try to get an introduction through a warm introduction, maybe through one founder or someone else in their network. You look on LinkedIn and you say, who do these people know? Who do they respect? Because they get so many emails, they need someone to help them with the vetting process. So I've tried to get a warm introduction. There were some that didn't even meet with me at a warm introduction. And then I met them on Twitter, and then we had conversations, and then it was like, oh, well, you're someone I know. So I think it's important, to recognize that, maybe the first time it doesn't work. But if you change your tactics, or if you change your strategy, or if you, meet someone for coffee because, you happen to be in the town that they're in. I mean, there's a lot of kind of tried and true sales strategies that can help you get through. And so I think that the most important thing is stack rank the people who are important. This is something I think that is much more important. You can send out 200 cold emails and spray and pray, and you might not get in front of the best people. But if you really want to get in front of someone, if you're really excited to get in front of someone, put time into those emails. There's a lot of investors, and this is sort of one of my old tricks. There's a lot of investors who've written books. Read their book. Tell them that you love what's on page 78. If you tell someone that you've read their entire book and you outline the things that you love about their book, I guarantee you that person doesn't get that many emails from people who are smart, thoughtful, and who've read their book. So that's the thing where it takes time to do a really great cold email. But I think if you put time into it and you persevere and you don't take no for an answer, oftentimes you can turn a no into a yes.
That's so awesome. And I was going to say, perhaps even get more of attention if you come with questions on the footnotes in the appendix section of the book.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I would say, wow, you really did read it. That's really encouraging, I think, for a lot of the founders that are tuned into this conversation. I think, especially with the pandemic, they've been very, very persistent in reaching a lot of investors. So I think the key takeaway for all the founders tuned in right now, keep emailing, keep being persistent, and don't give up. Yeah. Turning the conversation a little bit more into equality, et cetera, even though a lot of people put quite a lot of effort into improving gender and racial equity here in the US, we still see a lot of issues raised here and there every day. Just use the venture capital industry as an example. Of all the US-based VC partners in 2020, only 4.9% are women, with 33% of them being women of color. Why does this happen, in your opinion, and how can we change that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an unfortunate reality, and there's a lot of work to be done. I'd say at General Catalyst, we've been very focused on this, and I'm very proud that our chairman Ken Chenault, being he was one of the foremost African American CEOs when he was the CEO of Amex for 2 decades, and now leads our firm. And he's been very focused on this, on changing this dynamic, not only in venture capital but across business. What I'd say is it takes time. And that's not an excuse, but it does take time. But I have been very, very humbled and fortunate to see it change during my 5 years in venture capital. When I was starting in venture capital 5 years ago, it wasn't uncommon to just see, myself in the room, to only, to very much to be the only woman, to see every firm had one woman. Maybe they weren't actually writing checks. It was a different time even 5 years ago. And now what I think is amazing is there are so many people who've kind of risen up the ranks, who are being trained, people who have founded companies. I mean, this is another thing that's extraordinary, as you see women and minority founders who've sold companies that are now being, sought after to join prominent venture capital firms. And what I'm hopeful of is that it's important that we just stay mindful that we need to be focused on this issue. But getting the way that we ultimately solve the issue is by getting more diversity into venture capital firms, because we know from science that people who join venture capital firms invest in more diverse portfolios. One of the things I'm really proud of is that I have a very diverse portfolio, and it's not something where I'm saying I'm going to only invest in a founder from this country or a founder who looks like X. Like, I'm investing in the best founders, and what's extraordinary about it is that many of them happen to be women and minorities. And so I think that's ultimately where the change is going to come from, is the more diversity that you can have in the investor community, the more diverse founders you're ultimately going to have. And it's going to just change the dynamic very quickly once we can get to that point. So I think there's been a lot of work done in the last few years. A lot more work needs to be done. And I'm extremely proud that GC has been focused on this.
I love it. And, what words of encouragement would you like to share with a lot of the female founders that we have? We have many, and a lot of diversity here at Newchip around the world. Oftentimes, they're met with a lot of those constraints where they don't get the meetings. What words of advice do you have for them so that they can stand out and move with impact?
The thing that I'd say is that there's so many good examples now. I look at someone like Rachel Romer Carlson, who, her company is extraordinary. The people that she's raised capital from, we wrote one of the largest checks in history of our firm into her company almost 2 years ago now. She's leading, 400, 500 people. She's meeting with the CEOs of Fortune 100 companies to broker these important deals to upskill the American workforce. What I think is important is there are so many great examples of women who have built unicorn companies, multi-billion-dollar companies, who should lead by example. And they have these stories of how difficult it was in the early days, but because they've achieved what they have, the next generation of founders might have it a little bit easier. And they have a model to look after of, okay, this is how this can be done. And so I'm really excited that there are so many, women who have modeled this kind of behavior, who have done extraordinarily well, who've built great companies. I mean, when you look at Whitney Wolf, who built Bumble, taking the company public and bringing her child the day when she takes the company public. I mean, there's so many great examples that I can only say, I think the world is changing. I hope it's changing, and we're so excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I remember that day when it happened. To come to almost a conclusion here in this conversation, what advice do you have for founders and entrepreneurs in the Newchip ecosystem, but around the world, who genuinely want to make an impact, who want to change this planet for the better?
Yeah, I think there's no more noble a mission than to build a company that's solving a civic mission or an important purpose. And, when you think about, yes, it's a hard journey. Yes, you're going to hear no a lot, but it's a worthwhile endeavor. And if you have a vision for something that you think can be really radically improved by technology, you have people that you want to build with, there's no better and more noble way to spend your time in many cases. And so I think if you have a vision that's important, if you're working on a civic mission, yes, it will be hard, but stick with it. It's an extraordinary thing to do for humanity. And there's so many good examples of people who've changed the world through technology.
Excellent. Katherine, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure hearing your perspectives, your thoughts, and having you here as our special guest. For everyone, once again, this is Katherine Boyle from General Catalyst. She's a partner at this firm. Thank you so much, Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful.